Thank you, Vakar, and thank you, Middlesex University, for giving me this fantastic opportunity to be chair in design and to give this inaugural lecture. And what I'm going to do is to reflect on my career, my life so far, and including some of the downs as well as the ups, because part of my interest is in the relationship between autobiography and history. I find that really interesting. So to begin with, gender is a very, really important aspect of what I look at. And this is just to start with. This is a photograph of me in my most senior management role, which was Dean of Media Arts at Southampton Solent. And there were actually 5 men above that senior management team, so I was the kind of token woman. So I have known that kind of existence, and I'm happy to say it's not like that at Middlesex. So the title of this inaugural lecture is taken from the American art historian Norman Bryson's book, Looking at the Overlooked. And thank you to Hilary Robinson for alerting me to this. It just came out of my head, but obviously I'd read the book and had forgotten, so I don't want to be accused of plagiarism, so here I am acknowledging the title, Looking at the Overlooked, 4 essays on still life painting. And in his last chapter in that book, he talks about still life and the feminine space, and I'm quoting him. He asks what the distinctions between low plane reality and high plane reality are, between still life and the supposedly higher genres of painting. What may they have to do with gender positions and gender ideology? And I'd like to build on that and to ask what the current hierarchies are, which position art above design and art above, way above, popular culture. Perhaps what might that tell us about gender positions as well? So what I'm going to do very, very swiftly, don't worry, is begin with some academic framing, but that won't last too long, and then I'll get into some autobiographical stuff. I mean, my point of view is that whilst it's become acceptable since the writing at least of the Frankfurt School in the 30s to analyse most aspects of mass culture or popular culture using the concept of modernity to critique the forces at play, the false consciousness being generated to reveal that, the exploitation taking place. I think it's less common to write about modernity in a different sense, as being part of it, being within it, as a subjective experience. And that's really what interests me, to consider modernity as something which can be negotiated rather than something that's done to us, rather than being censorious, as is often the case in academic writing. And what I'm doing, I've also contrasted that with one of the images that really fascinates me by Eduardo Palazzi, which is one of his collages using American popular culture in a very open and positive way. He's not being ironic and he's not being dismissive of this visual image. And here's one of my favourite singers, George Melly. So, as Ian Chambers has argued in relation to the writing of Theodore Adorno and popular music, and I'm quoting, Adorno's emphasis upon the determining role played by the cultural apparatus in the production of 20th century music in Western Europe and the United States has come to play a decisive, often a central part in critical common sense. Therefore, there is a taken for grantedness about analysing the popular from an abstract theoretical position, from the critical common sense of the ivory tower, the academic safe place. And this perspective, I think, is aligned with the kind of pro-modernist, pro-avant-garde position that reinforces those existing hierarchies, including those of gender. So that's my kind of starting point for a lot of the work I do, and one in which I explore in my latest book, Out of the Ivory Tower. So it's the association between the popular, the trivial, the inferior, which characterises a lot of the critics of popular culture, I think. And by placing popular culture into this talk, I think I'm invoking a feminist reading, as Husserl has argued in After the Great Divide. In his chapter, Mass Culture as Woman, Modernism's Other, and I quote, "It is indeed striking to observe how the political, psychological and aesthetic discourse around the turn of the century, that's 19th century, consistently and obsessively genders mass culture and the masses as feminine, while high culture, whether traditional or modern, clearly remains the privileged realm of male activities." So what troubles Husserl and what troubles me is the problem is not the desire to differentiate between forms of high art and so-called depraved forms of mass culture and its co-options. The problem is rather the persistent gendering as feminine of that which is devalued. So that's my kind of starting point. And to begin with, I thought, what do you do in an inaugural lecture? So I thought, well, I'll look at everything I've written. So here's 8 covers of books that I've written or played a part in editing, or here's the journal that I edit. So I laid out these covers. They're in kind of chronological order. And what strikes me looking at these now is that the books all investigate areas which are overlooked by the kind of mainstream in terms of art history. As Bakar said, the Blue Guide was the first cultural travel guide to the former GDR, just after the Berlin Wall came down. Interior design since 1900, that was really the first thematic history of interior design and decoration for a general or student reader, and I'm very proud to be able to write for that kind of audience. I think there's an interest here when I look across this collection in crossing boundaries and contesting hierarchies. And I kind of then asked myself, I was having a little kind of analysis session, I sort of asked myself, well, why do I do this? So I look back at my childhood, as all good psychoanalysis does, and I began with my grandfather. So this is my maternal grandfather, Tom Carr, and he was a sporting artist, which is slightly, I know, controversial, and I do worry about people coming to my house, and I do tend to hide the pictures if I think it might cause offence. But he was a great character. He began his working life in the Durham coal mines. Then he worked during the war making anchors for the Navy, but then injured his back doing that. And whilst he was in hospital, he sketched the horses and hounds that he really missed while he was flat on his back. And that gained him a place to study fine art at King's College, then part of Durham University, now part of Newcastle University. And he took what was then a 2-year certificate course in fine art and forged a career for himself, chronicling the lives and times of hunts throughout England and Scotland, which makes his work quite a kind of minority taste. And I used to trail around a bit with him and met all these people. It was quite interesting. He also worked as a book illustrator. For example, we're seeing here on that bottom image there is a page from Come Pony Trekking With Me by Veronica Heath from 1966. So he kind of worked as a commercial illustrator as well. He also produced dry point etchings. Here we see the top one there is called Hold Hard Please, in an edition of 75. And he printed these in his studio, located just beside his home in the borders of England and Scotland. And this was more or less given to him by the Duke of Buccleuch. And here I am as a kid sitting on the steps with of his studio, and I can still remember the sort of smell of oil paint and ink wafting through the summer air, because I always seemed to spend summer there as a kid. you had to like animals if you were around my grandfather. So here I am again being not really enjoying the attention of a dog. And that's why I've got, I think, a lifelong phobia of dogs. And after being exposed to the local Hunt's puppies, because my granddad was a what was called a puppy walker, so he used to get a lot of the hounds when they were young to sort of look after. Horses were also a big part of my granddad's life. So here's my mum, the older of the two, sitting on the wall. And she really took from him, not his love of horses, she hated them, but his love of art. And she trained to become an art teacher at Neville's Cross College in Durham. And she went on to take a second degree in art history and established the education programme at the Lane Art Gallery in Newcastle during the 80s. And she still paints, and she loves artists like Matisse and Picasso, and she passed that on to me, which was certainly not my grandfather's taste. And she also inspired me with the belief that everyone should have the opportunity to benefit from education, particularly as our own mother passed the entrance exam to the local grammar school, but was sent into service to become a servant, as her family needed the income and education was wasted on girls. That was the kind of opinion. So I've grown up with that belief in education, and particularly education in art and design. Both grandmothers, you're seeing here, had a formative influence on me as well. From them, I learnt warmth, domesticity, and also, I think, a love of popular culture. So I'm a very bad design historian because my grandmother, in the top left, my paternal grandmother, had a fantastic china cabinet that I remember as a kid, with loads of Hollywood memorabilia in it and china and stuff. And my aunties got rid of it, and I never took a photograph of it, so it's kind of there in my memory. So that's the nearest I could get, really. But that used to fascinate me as a kid, looking inside this little world of popular culture. And there's my maternal grandmother, and she always wanted to look like Clara Bow, who was a great Hollywood film star. And there's my other grandma, was also in service in Hampshire, near Petersfield, and there she is playing croquet on the lawn in the big country house that she worked in. So that's kind of part of my background, and that inspiration really fed into this book, which was published in 2001, called Hollywood Beyond the Screen, and that investigated links between Hollywood cinema and popular design. And as part of that research, I really loved looking at all this stuff, Art Deco screen images like this. This is from MGM film of 28, designed by Cedric Gibbons, who'd been to Paris, got all the inspiration of the Art Deco style and brought it back. And you can see that in the ziggurat forms of the fireplace and the shimmering surfaces. And this is the racy home of Joan Crawford in the film. And we also have the racy Anita Page in her daring flapper attire, resplendent with Art Deco gilded screen in the background, in the ziggurat form, a day bed, those lovely little tub chairs, and the shiny floor surfaces. This was all done to create the correct image on the screen, of course. And also I looked at Hollywood musicals, which was great. I looked at Ginger Rogers in Top Hat from 35, designed by Carol Clark for RKO. And this is the height of Hollywood glamour, which my grandmothers both loved. And I loved too. And yeah, so that's that. But it was modern architecture that came to rescue my family from the backwaters of Durham, the minefield, you know, the sort of going down the mine and so on, the legacy of coal mining and savage animals, I'm pleased to say. So my father studied architecture at the same King's College that my grandfather studied fine art. And this meant that we could move from a freezing cold prefabricated house that you see there, where I lived as a kid in the top left. There's my mum hanging out the washing. We could move from there into this fantastic new semi-detached house in Whitley Bay on the coast. And that was fantastic. we moved into this marvel of modernity in 1963 when my dad got a job at the Commercial Architects Marshall and Tweedy in Newcastle. And if anybody knows about the architect or knows of any archives, let me know, because I can't find anything. He trained as a modern architect, and he was very much at home amongst the pilotis and flat roofs of the estate's shopping centre, which me and my mum and brother and sister walked to whilst he commuted to Newcastle in the car. And this was fantastic because you had the very first supermarket in the distance there, Fine Fare, and you could walk in and serve yourself, and there were deep freezers with things like fish fingers. So this was really, really exciting. It was kind of a new age, a brave new world of modernism, I think, and definitely my dad was part of that. He was working on the new Wilkinson sword factory at this point to be built just up the road at Cramlington, Newtown, and I can't find an image of that at all. And I remember it though. It was a very sleek, modernist factory built for the High Wycombe-based company to supply the demand for Teflon-coated stainless steel razor blades, which had been launched in 61. And by 64, the company went public and they were exporting to 50 countries, with 60% of their production going overseas. He also designed, as you can see here, social housing in Rye Hill in Newcastle, which has now been demolished, but he was awarded an RIBA regional medal in 66 for this. The first year they were introduced, and we watched him proudly being interviewed on Look North, which was the regional news programme in our very modernist living room. We always had to have very tidy kind of spare living spaces with the odd rubber plant and orange cushion. It was all very modern. And I'm grateful to Jill Headley, who's here, for encouraging me to scan in this, which is an invite my father did when he was still a student studying architecture at King's College. He gave it to me as part of a bundle of stuff before he died. But here's the invite he designed for the Arts Ball in 1956. And this was, and Jill recently showed it as a conference hosted by Newcastle University at the Live Art Theatre, which was very touching. And it was quite strange to find my personal past entering the world of scholarly study. And part of what my father did, he really enthused me about modern architecture, but he also recounted in detail his delight at seeing this groundbreaking exhibition, Man, Machine and Motion, in the Hutton Gallery, part of King's College, in 1955 as a student. And this partly lies behind my interest in the independent group, as Richard Hamilton, who was the main protagonist who put this show together, he was then teaching at King's College, and I'm sure my father went to some of his lectures and remembered him being there. So that was partly behind my interest in the independent group. Also, part of the independent group were Alison and Peter Smithson. I'm showing you here their Hunstanton School they designed, and they also trained at King's College. And their vision of the reforming nature of modern architecture very much chimed with that of my father, very much from the same sort of school of thought, and of the independent group. So that's kind of just the beginning, just to tell you a bit about my family background and perhaps why it is I have such a mixture of interests, if you like, from the history of art through the history of design, through looking at popular culture. So what really intrigues me was, and still is, the independent group. And this is, in case you don't know much about them, but if you know me, you will know about them, because I've been obsessed with them for at least 30 years. But the key members you can see up there. Part of what interests me is they were architects and designers working with theorists, with writers, working with artists and photographers. They all worked together and came up with similar concerns and similar themes, and I think that's really important. And they were the same generation as my parents, and I think with the same values and the same outlook, and perhaps I think this is part of their attraction. So my research on the independent group has continued since I first read Lawrence Alloway's chapter on British pop art in Lucy Lippard's 1966 book on pop art. Sitting in my student digs while an undergraduate in Whitley Bay, and a whole new world opened up for me, really. I read with wonder about a group of architects, artists, designers, musicians and writers who worked together and looked at all aspects of culture with the same intensity and the same level of analysis. And at that time I was studying for a degree at what was then Newcastle Polytechnic, and was wrestling with painting. Actually, it was a history of art and design degree, but we had to do practice one day a week, which is quite interesting. So we did painting. Well, I did painting. So we did that one day a week. We also studied popular film, popular design, modern architecture, and the history of art, very much within a political and social context. And kind of given my background, the severity of the Marxist approaches didn't fit my experiences, nor did the kind of new linguistic theory that was coming in at that time. I mean, this is kind of the 70s. And it didn't seem to apply to imagery. And philosophy imported to look at imagery either, I kind of had problems with. And I hankered for something which took popular culture as seriously as so-called high culture. And this I found with the independent group. And so my research has always concentrated as well on real people and real lives, interviewing and meeting with the protagonists. I was really lucky that I started this quite early, so I did manage to meet most of them, searching in the archives. And just recently, my partner Jimmy, who's here, drove me around all the places that they lived in London when they met as the independent group. This is the level of my research. So here's the group, one of the groups from This Is Tomorrow, sitting in what's called, funnily enough, Camera Street, the Smithsons, Palazzi and Nigel Henderson, and that's the house that the Smithsons lived in at that time. Other real people were John McHale, up there on the left, and Magda Cordell, the painter, whose fantastic imagery you can see on the bottom there, really underrated images of women's physical forms. And there's John McHale's collage of man-made America. And they lived with Magda's husband in a kind of menage a trois in Cleveland Square at that house. So they all lived together as well. And we also, another couple that was important was Sylvia Slee and Lawrence Alloway. And this is the house they lived in at the time. And I worked with Sylvia on this exhibition they had in Philadelphia, which she organised, called An Unnerving Romanticism, which was really sweet. Sadly, she died last year. And again, a fantastic artist. Other people who were important, Mary and Raina Banham. There's Lawrence Alloway at This Is Tomorrow. And Thomas Maldonado. I think this is another aspect of the independent group that gets overlooked, their connections with design, with Ulm, with what was happening in Milan as well, was really important to their concerns. And a lot of their concerns were about popular culture. Here we've got Eduardo Palazzi's famous Bunk set of screen prints. And Frank Whitford wrote in the introduction to this set, "It is already part of him, much more than Michelangelo." And that's, again, reinforcing what I'm saying about their attitude to popular culture being a part of them. They're not looking askance. They've grown up with this stuff. They really like it. And they're celebrating it as great visual culture. And, I mean, they were also directly involved in popular culture as well, not just kind of looking at it and collecting it in scrapbooks. Here's something I discovered recently, a eureka moment in the British Library that you don't imagine is going to happen to you when you find the Melody Maker on the shelf. And in it, you find photographs of the birth of a band, Ronnie Scott, the famous jazz musician. And look, it's photographed by Nigel Henderson, a member of the independent group. And this, you know, it's sort of something that isn't really included in any sorts of official histories. And these enthusiasms really led them to their sort of best-known exhibition, This Is Tomorrow, at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 56. And here we're seeing Marilyn Monroe, we're seeing Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet, we're seeing a mock-up of a Guinness bottle, we're seeing the Van Gogh's Sunflowers, the print, because that was the most popular print sold at the National Gallery at the time, and a kind of rather bemused gallery assistant just to the left. And a jukebox played all the time throughout this exhibition, and there were complaints about the loud rock and roll music, which I think is quite amusing. This is the poster for Forbidden Planet, and this was a Hollywood film which the independent group really admired. It was popular, yeah, they admired that. They also admired the fact the plot line was so complex and demanding. It was based on The Tempest. There was also a really experimental music score, based one of the very first uses of electronic music on the film score. So it was a really important film from all points of view. This show's often celebrated as the first example of pop art in the well-worn trajectory of the story of modern art. However, it was an exhibition about design, I would always argue. As we can see it from Alloway's quote from the catalogue, he says, "In This Is Tomorrow, the visitor is exposed to space effects, play with signs, a wide range of materials and structures, which taken together make of art and architecture a many-channeled activity, as factual and far from ideal standards as the street outside." And Lawrence Alloway was a canny, he was highly ambitious and eventually did really well, becoming director of the Guggenheim and going on to be a really important art critic. And he does write actually really well, quite important for a critic. But at this point, he was interested in design, and his essay is called Design as a Human Activity. And this very, very often gets left out of accounts of what they did. And so the street's important to them. Nigel Henderson, also a member of the group, he photographed the East End of London as part of a kind of, his wife was involved in a mass observation project, and he kind of sucked up this anthropological vibe and went round photographing things in quite a deadpan way. But they're fantastically interesting. Here we've got children playing on the street that we never see today. A wig stall in Petticoat Lane, which is probably changed beyond recognition. And all this tied in, so we've got Henderson taking the photographs. Here we've got Alison and Peter Smithson creating their special grill to present at the Architectural Congress, CIAM, in 53. And you can see how they've taken the idea of street games and the sort of chance encounter and the random nature of this and used it as part of their design plans and design layouts. They also were important. They designed this, the House of the Future, for the Ideal Home exhibition in 1956. And this was, I always talk about this in terms of the ephemeral. This was a throwaway house or a trade-in house. You would buy this like as a family, and if you got smaller, you could trade in for a smaller house, or if you got more children or whatever, you could expand it and trade it in for something larger. So there wasn't an idea of a fixed bricks and mortar that I think the British particularly are so infatuated with. So they designed this. So for them, the House of the Future would be something you traded in. You wouldn't be emotionally invested in it. And they hired actors in sort of science fiction gear to people the house and to work with the hostess trolley and so on. So that's one of the Smithson's really interesting projects, I think. And another image which is very often associated with the independent group is this one. On the left, we're seeing the poster that was the original concept behind the image, which Richard Hamilton designed for This Is Tomorrow. And then on the right-hand side, we're seeing the collage that was the artwork for the poster. And what happened was that becomes more and more seen as the artwork as we reach the 60s. What interested me actually looking at it recently was that the cut-off point on the bottom is lower on the collage than it is on the poster, but it's the kind of thing art historians look at, I suppose. So I think these kinds of images, here we've got everything that's the most modern and most up-to-date for 1956. And I think this partly prompted my own interest in interiors and why I kind of moved into that area. The sort of Cinderella, I think, of the design history world. It's caught between architectural history and design history. And it's very early days still for the subject, and I'm pleased to say Middlesex is really forging ahead with some great people and some great work in that area, bringing together practice and history and theory, and which is really exciting. So the research is feeding into the teaching into the research. And again, I found myself looking at the overlooked, the thing which isn't taken seriously, but which actually has a massive effect on everybody's lives. So we see here the first book I did, Interior Design since 1900, and I just found that letter from David Hicks, quite a leading British interior designer, congratulating me on the book, which I forgot who'd sent me, so it was quite sweet. The book's now in its third edition, translated into French, Spanish and Korean. The journal was published by Berg from 2010, and is going from strength to strength. And I think asserting the importance and cross-disciplinary nature of the subject. And also my book, Designing Liners, came out in, I think, 2005 and charted the design of interiors from the mid-19th century up to what I would argue is the last ocean liner, the QE2. And my methodology, what I did, there were so many ships and so many interiors, I thought, what am I going to do with this lot? So I tracked it through using the rise of the professional designer against the kind of social, political and technical changes in seafaring. And this study took me into some interesting archives of shipping companies, the Caird Library at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and the supported enthusiasm offered there by the curator of ship history, John Graves, who I'm pleased to say is here this evening, in particular stood me in good stead and really opened my eyes to a new way of seeing history. And it's turned into a long-standing working relationship with John and the museum, which has produced one successful HRC-funded student, Harriet McKay, who wrote on the Union Castle line, and Daniel Davis, who's about to start here in October, looking at P&O. And what particularly interested me was the kind of juxtaposition, as a bit of a theme here through the talk, between the glamorous decoration and the kind of heavy engineering, which is shot through with social and spatial demarcations. And so here we're seeing the glamorous ballroom on the Empress of Britain, designed by the portrait painter James Lavery, surprisingly, complete with pink ostrich feathers, a glitter ball, and the sort of sky at night was painted in that dome. So I think this is a beautiful image. And I did get quite seduced by these images. They're all set up and taken by studio photographers before the ship set sail. And, they probably look a bit more lackluster once they've been used. So that's that. The other things that I looked at as part of the book that I really enjoyed was the Ranpura and the Viceroy of India. And the Maritime Museum were kind enough to let me look through the books that they've got there stored in the archive, which have loads of fabrics samples in them and sort of sketches of the interiors, which I found really interesting. And it's part of my take, which is all about the real world and real people. The other thing I got really interested in, back to the subject of gender, was this woman called Elsie McKay. And she was the first woman designer I could find who worked on ocean liners. And she did the Viceroy of India in 1929. And here we're seeing the swimming pool, the first one on the P&O liner, very much in the bottom of the ship, based on the RAC swimming pool in Pall Mall, with very much like neoclassical decoration. Here she is, sitting in the centre, a bit like the photograph I showed you at the beginning. Here she is, the only one not wearing a hat. And this is at the shipyards in Belfast. And these are all the kind of guys who work on the shipyard. And sitting next to her with the kind of captain's hat is Lord Inchcote, her father, who was the one who introduced her to all this. And it's interesting, she thought she was being paid by P&O to do this design work, but actually it was her father who was paying her out of his own money. But anyway, that's Elsie. And she designed things like this, the first-class smoking room, which is in real Old English style. And I think the whole idea is to make you feel you're not on a ship, that you're actually sitting in some kind of stately home, if you like. But I still find things like this really, really fascinating, and based on the kind of Stuart examples. And this is based on a palace in Bromley by Bow, which is now reinstalled at the V&A that she studies as part of her research. And I would love to write a biography of her, actually, because she was in Hollywood films, she was on the stage in Broadway, she was married 3 times, and she was killed tragically trying to be the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an aeroplane. So I think against the wishes of her family. So she was pretty interesting as an individual. Which brought me to the QE2 design team, and here we see David Hicks amongst the great and the good of British design. And this was another interesting argument, or tracked through an interesting development when I looked at the design of the QE2. The initial advisory board was set up by Cunard, and it consisted of the wife of the Cunard chairman, Lady Brocklebank, the vice chairman, a naval architect, Dan Wallace, and advice from the interior decorator, Jeanne Monroe. And this was in 1961, though, that there's a real juncture happened, and it was critiqued by Architectural Review as being, this was a flagship for the nation. There was £17.5 million being lent by the government. It was the moment of the kind of white hot heat of technology. What were we doing producing yet another country house, So it's interesting that Parliament stepped in, and the Council of Industrial Design met with Cunard, and a whole new bunch of designers were sort of brought in, or shipped in, if you pardon the pun. And we have a new Cunard board was appointed. And we see here that Lady Tweedsmuir, Cunard's first woman director, who's advising on the practical aspects of the Q4 from the passenger viewpoint, because obviously she couldn't really talk about anything very important or technical, so she's talking about the passenger. So we get this whole raft of new people coming in, and Lord Brocklebank was forced to retire, so too his wife departed from the whole design fiasco. So we get the Design Council's team coming in. This is a shot of the QE2 still sailing in Gibraltar in April 2005, but sadly now no longer at sea. Here's Jeanne Monroe, who I think, again, is another interesting figure. Here she is in a society newspaper, and they're really picking out the fact that she's wearing pearls with her skiing clothes, which I think is, quite an important achievement. So she gradually was, taken off the QE2 project and was replaced by the sort of Design Council approved male designers. So we get a kind of the idea of a swinging ship, and I just love looking through some of these publicity shots of the ship. So here's the first class cabin. Here's the Queen's Room by Michael Inchbald, and he designed those fantastic kind of tulip pillars that are mirrored with his specially designed chairs and so on. It's a real kind of modernist capsule. The Columbia Restaurant by Dennis Lennon. So that was a real fun project, and one which I really enjoyed. And as Vakar said, just lately I've entered the world of curating with some trepidation, but the ICA were fantastic and really helped me along with this. And what we did was to take the Fox Reading Room and use that to kind of commemorate the independent group. And it was the person I worked with was Matt Williams, who was really supportive and had some great ideas. This is the room from one angle. Now this is what he suggested, and Matt, as a curator of a really important arts institution, I'm interested that he reads interiors magazines and journals. So he gets a lot of his ideas from there. And what we did, that far wall, is a photograph that I had, and he's blew that up and printed it on vinyl. And so it was pasted onto the wall. So it's looking like when you walk into the room, as if you're going back into the 50s, because this photograph is from the official opening of the first ICA's exhibition at Dover Street when they were located there. So the idea is to go in and you feel you're back in that moment, that was his idea, and I think it's just great. We also reinforced that by the kind of steely grey carpet and the sort of dull grey curtain which covered a wall that couldn't be used anyway, but added to that kind of idea of the ICA as a home for the artists, for the avant-garde. We also had artworks on the wall. So on the right we're seeing a John McHale telemath collage, which is fantastic. So what I did was to just select one kind of notable piece by each of the leading artists. So here we're seeing William Turnbull's screen print, which his son Alex Turnbull lent us. In the middle we've got a Magda Cordell monoprint, which again is one of her fantastic female forms. We've got Shattered Glass by Nigel Henderson, and then the far end we've got a drawing by Richard Hamilton. But what also interests me is obviously the popular side of things, the ephemeral. So we got into what I now know, doing curating, are called vitrines, these glass kind of cabinets. And what we did was to put in there a lot of examples of the ephemera around the exhibitions of the independent group. So we've got, in this case, the exhibition catalogues, Man, Machine and Motion, the private view cards, and so on. And I thought that was important to show all that alongside the fine artworks. I mean, some people thought that detracted from the fine art, but I would say it's equally important from that kind of visual culture point of view. Also in the vitrines we've got album covers by Frank Cordell. I don't think I've got that now. And so it kind of gives you a whole picture of the 1950s, that kind of moment of the independent group. And it seems to have been pretty well received, and a lot of people have said, well, it should have been slightly bigger, the exhibition. So we'll see. And what I'm doing at the moment is, on the right-hand side is my forthcoming book for Manchester University Press, and Vakar will be relieved to see it says November 2030. Hopefully, yeah. So, and on this side we've got the Journal of Visual Culture. I've just been the guest editor for the next issue, which is fantastic, and thanks to Mark Smith, the editor-in-chief, for helping me with that. And we've got contributors to that by Vicky Walsh, Barry Curtis, who was here for a long time, Ben Highmore, Ben Cranfield, Stephen Kite, and Richard Hornsey, and I thank them for their contributions. So I'm continuing really with the same themes and the same obsessions of bringing to the fore the overlooked aspects of our cultural heritage. But strangely, I find this to be more and more in the mainstream. I'm approached by research students, I'm invited to closed seminars at the Tate, and now I find I own a valuable archive rather than a bunch of research materials. And as the independent group enter the mainstream, I find myself perhaps looking for another subject which has been overlooked. And just to end with, I thought I'd introduce Block, but there's still many battles to be fought, and I think, and thank you to Middlesex and to Block, and particularly Barry Curtis and John Bird, who I worked with for the article in this issue, number 10, And yeah, I'm at the bottom now, I'm Massey Penny Start. I had to, my terrible scanning meant I cropped off John Tagg, which was really bad, but anyway. But I just wanted to end with that, just to say that I think, you know, we're starting to build the same sort of spirit here at Middlesex in the School of Art and Design, and just thank everybody that's helped me along the way. Okay, thank you.